Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us this afternoon for our webinar on working successfully in a changing India. In just a moment, I'll hand you over to Sunit, who's going to be sharing his many insights and experience with you for the next hour. But I'm just going to do a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. It's great to see a mix of familiar names and some new names with us this afternoon. So thank you for giving up your time to join us. I know how busy everyone is. My name's Kathy Wellings, and if you don't know me, I'm the director here at the London School of International Communication. I think I certainly know some of the names that are popping up on the list, and nice to see the new people joining us too. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. We're together here for about an hour this afternoon. We'll start very shortly. If you have questions, your microphones are on mute because we have lots of different people joining. So if you don't mind sending any questions via chat, that would be great. You should see a chat function at the bottom right of your screen. So as the questions come to mind, please feel free just to type them in for us, but we'll probably save most of the questions till the end of the session, if that's okay. The other thing that Sunit might ask you to do is to put your hand up during the session. So he might ask some questions where it's a yes or no, just put your hand up, or he might ask you some questions where you need to perhaps pop some answers in the chat function. So please do join in. I think these things are always much more engaging when people participate. It will be fairly one way, as I say, because we have a lot of people on the call, but where you do have the option to chat and participate, please join us. We are recording the session for those that haven't been able to join, or if you'd like a copy, we'll share it round afterwards as well. So I'm just very quickly going to introduce Sunit Jilla. I've known Sunit for many years. He has huge amounts of experience both in doing business between European countries and India, and also many years of delivering webinars like these, and also much longer in-depth cross-cultural training programs. I think I've listened to Sunit talking about India, I don't know, probably a dozen times, and I never fail to learn something new, never fail to feel inspired to visit India again. So I hope you enjoy the session, and I'll hand over to Sunit now. So thank you, Sunit. I'll turn my webcam off and let you start yours.
Thank you very much, Kathy. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. If you're in the UK and Europe, good afternoon to all of you. If you're in other parts of the world, good morning or good evening. As Kathy introduced me, I'm Sunit Jilla and an intercultural trainer, been in this field for several years. And what we're planning to do today is try to understand how best you can work in a country like India, which is changing. Though being a developing economy, there is change in the air. So the objectives are fairly straightforward, to understand more about the cultural diversity within India and also to get a better understanding. And what I mean by that is, just give you a little example here. About a couple of months ago, I took a flight within India from the southern state of or city of Hyderabad, and I flew to Delhi, which is in northern India. It was morning 7 o'clock, and the air hostess came with her trolley serving breakfast, and she asked me, veg or non-veg? Now in India, you're a vegetarian, and if you eat meat or eggs too, you're not a vegetarian. So I said veg. And then she said, South Indian veg or North Indian veg? So this gives you an idea that even in a country like India, just on a flight of 2 hours, you have 3 meal options for breakfast. And the country is very diverse. And how do you leverage that? By understanding the differences within the country. So we'll touch upon that as we go along. And more importantly, looking at the cultural drivers. What drives people in India? Like, for example, for those of you who live in the UK, we talk about a sense of humor. And even in business, having a good sense of humor is important. and through that we empathize with people. Or in the UK, we talk of it being a very fair and egalitarian society, and these are things are seen as important in business. So, what is it that drives people in India? Is it hierarchy? Is it status? Is it flexibility? Is it risk taking? So, we'll touch upon some of those. And like I said, as India is changing, some of those dynamics are also changing. And lastly, how do you apply that to the business environment? So, and in a country like India, one of the challenges can be that business and society tend to sort of almost intermingle. So, many of the values that you learn in society while growing up in a family, you tend to transpose to the business environment. So, unlike the West, if I'm using West in a very broad sense, where we say work is work and play is play, in India, work and play tend to sort of, intertwine. So let's start looking at a little more about India. So first thing what we're going to do is have a little overview about India, and to give a little sort of understanding about how social India works, what is India like, how many languages, what's the religion, what's the background. So a little overview because we only have about an hour, but trying to work with India, it becomes useful to understand India in a much more holistic sense. And India is not a country where you would say, give me 10 top tips of how to work with India. Yes, one can give the 10 top tips, but India is a very varying country. And also, India is more of a paradox. And what I mean by that is what is true is also not true at the same time. In the sense that India is seen as the back office of the world, India is seen as a developing country. There are a fair number of illiterate people. There's a lot of poverty in India. But at the same time, India is seen as a superpower. India, the richest people in the world live in India. You have India is also a very peace-loving country, though most of our leaders have been murdered. So if you look at Indira Gandhi, the first Prime Minister, Mahatma Gandhi, one of our leaders in India, Rajiv Gandhi, the Prime Minister of India in 1990, most of them were assassinated. So this is where we are talking about India is a land of contrast. So it's good to understand India in a little more sort of holistic sense. Then we'll also look at some of the key values and attitudes that while India is changing, do some of these values and attitudes change? And to what degree would they change when you're interacting with your colleagues, business partners? So we'll have a glimpse into that. Then we'll obviously look at communication because communication is key. In fact, I think there was a statement saying communication is culture and culture is communication. And inevitably, we all communicate through our culture. And I remember, some years ago when I first came to the UK, well, almost 20 odd years ago, when I first came to the UK, I had an English secretary and had a full-fledged office, an English secretary. And one day, one of my Chinese clients rang me up. I was not at my desk. I was away on a sales call. So she said, I'm afraid Sunit is not in the office. He called me a second time, and unfortunately, I was not there even the second time. And she said the same thing. I'm afraid Sunit is not in the office. The third time, he got hold of me, and so he said, Sunit, before we come to talking business, I have a question for you. I said, yes. He said, why is your secretary always afraid when you're not in the office? So obviously, the first thing we realize, even in the UK, our communication is very metaphorical, is very figurative. So when you're saying, I apologize, I'm sorry, you say, I'm afraid. So when we work with different cultures, the first thing you realize, communication styles can be different. So we'll touch upon a little of communication with India. And lastly, we'll look at how do you develop sort of successful strategies, because when you're working with India, once you know enough about the culture, then you can say, okay, this is the culture. How do I sort of build my strategies in order to be able to accommodate this culture in order to succeed in the country? And then, like Kathy mentioned earlier, we'll have a short about 10 to 15 minutes for question and answers. But you're welcome to send your questions through chat during the session as you think about them. And then we will, before we go ahead further, so first thing we're going to look at is a bit of India. How many of you actually been to India? I can see about 8 or 9 participants. How many of you have been to India? If you want to just raise your hands, please. I can see Pfizer, Alex, Vanessa. Great. So we have almost 30% of our audience who actually been to India. That's good. So now let's look at what the statement says. You have Albert Einstein saying, when I read the Bhagavad Gita, now the Bhagavad Gita is the holy book of the Hindus, and about 82% of Indians are Hindus. And he says, when I read the Bhagavad Gita and reflect about how God created this universe, everything else seems so superfluous. We owe a lot to the Indians who taught us how to count, without which no worthwhile scientific discovery could have been made. Now, what he's referring to here is basically the binary system. So the binary system, or the digits 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, were developed in India, without which we'd have no computers. So when you look at India, in the changing India, you will find a lot of new things happening. Take a simple case about, Microsoft, Hotmail. Now, Hotmail was developed in India and by a man called Sabir Bhatia, and then sold to Microsoft for several $100 million. And if you look at a country like India today, in the last about 10 years, in India, the voting system is entirely electronic. So 2 years ago, some 588 million people voted electronically. But if you look at the UK, for example, they still have paper voting. So this is what I mean is India is a modern country, it's changing, but at the same time there will be a traditional India which sometimes can be sort of linked with the modern India. So we'll look at more of this as we go along. So we're going to do a little understanding of India. So the first about 5 or 10 minutes, because like I said, when you work with a country like India, it is good to understand India in a little more deeper way than just a few tips, a few ways of, oh, how do I do business, how do I do best. So it's difficult to have points when you look at a country like India. So what I've done is, to start off with, I've got a short quiz, and just to explain a little more about Indian culture, a little background about India. So have a look at this. How many states there are in India? If anybody wants to just send through the chat message, how many states do you think there are in India? Anyone wants to send some answers, please? Okay, I don't see any answers coming, but the answer is 29. Now, this gives you an idea. For example, when the British left India in 1947, there were about 15 or 16 states. And today, there are about 29 states. So India is constantly evolving, constantly dividing, so that you find that India is the states in India have different regions, and these regions will sort of give you an idea about how the differences in the regions can impact your business relationships. Let's have a look at the second question. Official languages. How many official languages there are in India? Okay. Oh, lots of answers coming up. Yes. Alex says 15, Pfizer says 20, Vanessa says 16, and Ben says 47. Okay. What I mean by official is all these languages are printed on every currency note or banknote in India. So the correct answer happens to be 22. So there are 22 major languages in India. Obviously, we have lots of accents and lots of dialects, but the official languages in India are 22. Well done to all of you for guessing those answers, because they all are fairly high numbers. So the official languages are 22, and English is the 23rd language. And if you look at the bank note or the currency note in India, you will find that the different languages which are prevailing in India are printed in every currency note. And why is this relevant? Now, this is relevant because when you're working with your colleagues or business partners in India, inevitably people may have different mother tongues. And when they have different mother tongues, you will find that their English language will be impacted by their mother tongue. So their accent may be different, the speed of speech may be different. So like we have Germans, the French, the Italians, all of them may speak English with a certain accent. Similarly, India having 22 languages, it is very, very common to find people with different accents. So this is worthwhile remembering that when you work with India, though English is largely the business language, the way people speak, etc., would be influenced by their mother tongue. Have a look at this religions. Any idea what the religions in India are? Any guesses on this one, please? Faiza says 5. And I can see more coming up. Marcia says 8. Alex says 10. Yes, there are lots of religions, but the main religions in India are Hinduism, Islam, Sikhism, Christianity, Buddhism, and Jainism. And when I mean main, for example, 82% of Hindus are 82% of Indians are Hindus, about 13% are Muslims, and then you have almost about single digit figures for the rest. So largely, India has a majority of Hindus and about 13% of Muslims. And the reason why, again, I'm putting up this little, sort of question is that because of that, you will have different festivals, you will have different holidays, you will have different, religious festivals, religious ceremonies. And when you're interacting with your colleagues, knowing that when a particular new year sort of falls as such. So, for example, I come from the south of India. My new year happens to be somewhere in April. And somebody in the west of India living in the state of Gujarat, or even, for example, Mumbai, you will have their new year somewhere coming around November. So what happens is that when you're working with your colleagues, it's important to understand when their New Year's would sort of occur, and this will help you, for example, greeting them, etc., and building sort of relationship with your colleagues. Okay, just the second last question: population of India. Any guesses? We have a very interactive audience. That's great. Ben says 1.2, Alex says 2, Faiza says 1.6. All of you are very, very close, and the answer is about 1.24 billion. Vanessa's almost got it spot on, like Ben. Thank you very much for those answers. Yeah, it's about 1.24, a bit approximate in that sense, because the population is changing every day. And more importantly, the population is growing at the rate of 1.5% every year. So what we're talking about here is that trying to understand that when you work with a country like India, and when you're traveling to India, when you work with India, it's important to bear in mind how the cities are being impacted by this population growth in terms of infrastructure, in terms of traveling time. So when you visit India and you're traveling from point A to point B, how much time do you allow for your traveling, for example? So if you're planning to have 3 meetings in a day, in some of the bigger cities, 3 meetings can be a bit ambitious, and you may not be able to do justice. So bearing in mind that in a country like India, this is one of the issues. Secondly, almost about 45% of Indians are below the age group of 25. So roughly between 15 and 25 years old people are almost 45% of the population. So what we're talking about here is that more than half the population is below the age group of 25. And therefore, when you or your colleagues are interacting with people in India, the age differential, because India is a status-driven society, can create a certain dynamic at work. So people may be more respecting, more deferential if there's an age difference. So bearing that in mind becomes quite useful. And lastly, looking at some of the cities in India. So some of you know we have Mumbai, Bengaluru, or which is called Bangalore, Bombay, Chennai, which was earlier called Madras. We have Calcutta, now called Kolkata, Hyderabad, and Delhi. So we have these major cities, and all these cities are almost what I would call is, the hub and the mainstay for India. And many of these cities will have different cultures, as you call microcultures. Like Mumbai is a city like go, go, go. It's a bit like New York. Bengaluru is more like the Silicon Valley of India. If you look at Chennai, Chennai tends to be much more where you have a lot of automotive parts, back offices, software development centers. So each of these cities will have a certain strength. So when you're interacting with India, it's good to know that each of these cities can also have a certain microculture which can be different from each other. So this was just a little idea about India as a country. and trying to sort of set the base before we go on to the next slides. So let's look at how sort of India sees itself. So modern India obviously is a very dynamic country. You will find people have a very sort of can-do attitude. People are very hospitable, and again, what do you mean by hospitality? In a country which is very hospitable, people are looking to build relationships, and through relationships, people are trying to build trust. So when you work with India, you may find many of your colleagues in India or your business partners who tend to be sort of a little more caring in terms of your environment, with how you arrive, whether you reach safely, try to sort of escort you, try to help you out with your both social and business needs, and that is seen as quite common in a country like India because of its relationship-based orientation. At the same time, India also is seen as a very innovative country. So modern Indians see themselves as very innovative. You have a lot of research and development. India has sent a space mission to Mars just about a year ago, and entirely or indigenously developed in India. And you will find, for example, the whole of India now has ID cards, and you have an entire database for the 1.24 billion people in India. And again, many people in India are not able to read and write. So what happens is that when you are having an identity card and you want to have a signature taken, they have to use their thumbprints. But unfortunately, we have a lot of laborers in India who use their, literally their physical hands to do work. And as a result, what happens is that you find that these people, they have lost their thumbprints. And therefore now, for when you're developing an ID card for these people, you have sort of, retinal recognition. So this is where we're talking about even having a simple ID card for people in India can be such a challenging sort of issue. And India also is a very aspirational and ambitious country. And what we mean by that? So I was in Hong Kong just about a month ago, and on the cover of the Time magazine there was a picture of a Bollywood actress, and what was the title? It said, you know one of the 100 most influential people in the world, a Bollywood actress being one of the 100 most influential people in the world, and her name is Priyanka Chopra. So if you look it up, and this is what I mean, is this is modern India. So when you're working with India, you may come across a lot of people, entrepreneurs, young CEOs, modern young engineers who will sort of fall into that category. And lastly, I remember picking up a magazine somewhere in 2011, again another Time magazine, and on the cover I saw a title saying India's latest exports, and I was quite surprised. And when I saw the sort of went into the what do you call them, detail, what it referred to as exports. Any guesses, anybody? It says India's latest exports. This was in August 2011, about 4 or 5 years ago. Any guesses what they were referring to? I can see some answers popping up. Alex is typing. Judy. Alex says films. Judy says talent. You guys are almost there. I can see Vanessa trying to say something. Vanessa says Bollywood. Well, all these are true, but Judy is almost close to the answer. Thank you, Judy. It talks about CEOs. So the article talks about when a company in the West is looking for a CEO, they normally first go to India. So if you look therefore at companies like MasterCard, Adobe, Microsoft, Google, Pepsi, and the list goes on, all these CEOs are originally from India. They have been born and brought up in India, gone to university in India, and then sort of migrated to the West. So this is just what we're talking about here, is that you will come across this sort of India of two sort of shapes and sizes. And bearing in mind in India that modern India sees itself in this sort of format. And that is what we mean about a changing India. And now what we're going to do next is we are going to look at some of the key values. So though India is changing, how do the key values sort of resonate in a modern India? So let's look at what the key values are likely to be and what their interaction will mean when you're working with India. So many of you probably may be familiar, especially some of you have traveled to India. So India is very much seen as a status-driven society. It is hierarchical and protocols matter. Gender equality is not the same as you would see in other parts of the world. So when you meet people, when you meet people, how do you shake hands? Where do you sit? What sort of, protocols you establish? If somebody's a senior person in a team, how do you sort of, show respect to them? Your business card, is it important? So all these little things will matter when you work with India. Take a little example to highlight why status and hierarchy seem very important in India. About a year and a half ago, or just I think it was 8 months ago, we had the Prime Minister of India, a man called Narendra Modi, who came to the UK, came to London, and obviously he was given a reception. But where was the reception given? Anybody has an idea where he was sort of given a reception? Anybody wants to have a guess in London where the reception was held for him? Okay, I can see participation. Yes, great. I'm having some answers coming up. I'll just wait for a few seconds. Ben says Buckingham Palace. Thank you for that. Marcia is coming up with something. That's me. Foreign Office. The answer is Wembley Stadium. So, because if he's the Prime Minister of India, he won't be having a small audience. The audience had to be about, I think Wembley Stadium has about 80,000 capacity. It was completely full. Because a man of his status who rules a country like India with 1.24 billion people has to be given the right amount of sort of, welcome to befit his status. So when you're working with India, so when you're working with a CEO or top leader, largely there's an expectation that you respect the person's seniority, and they may be a little more flashy in the outlook. They may have a better car. They maybe have a lot of sort of status symbols around them. So what we're trying to talk about here is that when you work with India, it is important to understand that unlike the UK, if some of you are from the UK, that India is not an egalitarian society. And flaunting your status, flaunting your wealth, flaunting your position is seen as perfectly legitimate, because that is a sign of a true leader. And this then starts breaking up into further things about what is leadership, what is a good manager. So this is something which makes you think when you operate in a country like India. So though India is a modern country, though things are changing, there is a drive to a certain extent towards egalitarian, but which is largely limited to more multinational firms rather than typical sort of Indian firms. So let's look at the next one, please. Building relationships and what we mean by that. So in a country like India, relationship building is seen as very paramount. That is, it's not a transactional society, and therefore people will sort of try to mingle. You have lack of privacy. So when you're working with people in India, in order to build relationships, it is okay or to get out of your comfort zone to share personal information. And you'll notice throughout India, when people are working with each other, they may share more information about each other. And another small but useful example was when about 2 years ago, when we had the new Prime Minister Narendra Modi, he met Barack Obama for the first time. And Barack Obama, the first thing he said to the Indian Prime Minister was, Came Cho, Prime Minister. The word Came Cho means how are you in one of the Indian languages. Now, why do you think Barack Obama did that? And you think, well, it's gimmicky, he's a politician, that's what politicians do. But rarely has ever any other president of the United States spoken an Indian language. So what we're trying to explain here is that Barack Obama realizes that a country like India is very relationship based. Its leaders are relationship based. And therefore, what did he do last year during November when we have Diwali? Diwali is an important festival. Some of you probably are aware. When we had the festival of Diwali, he made what we call as a White House speech for Diwali. And never ever in the history of the United States has any president made a White House speech for Diwali. So what we're talking about here is that realizing that how these matter. And I work with a lot of companies in the UK too. And I remember once working with a large company, and it was Diwali time, and I walked into the offices. They had a large sort of Diwali sort of design made of color on the floor of their reception. And in the canteen on that particular day, they served only Indian food because they were working with India, offshoring to India and outsourcing to India. So this is what we mean is by building relationships, is empathizing with people in India and trying to find out how you can build relationships by understanding like things like religion, things like trust. It's not a very transactional society at all, and therefore people may give you gifts. Now, in some cultures, gift giving can be frowned upon, but in India, giving gifts to each other, even business wise, is seen as one way of cementing relationships. Or your colleagues may take you out for dinner, and you may have very little me time when you are in India, but these are all efforts with your colleagues in India. Let's look at the next important point in a country like India, saving face. Now, many of you may have come across that since some of you have traveled to India. And saving face is generally applicable among many Asian societies. So, China, Japan, India, Korea. And saving face is something which is very vital to most people in India. And it impacts the way people communicate. Because I remember once reading a book by Craig Stotty, one of the intercultural, sort of authors and an authority, and he said the primary objective of communication in Asia and especially in India is about appeasement, being non-confrontational, being not causing conflict, and avoiding loss of face. So what we realize is that in the Western world, when we grow up here, we realize that the primary objective of communication is to share information. But in a country like India, the primary objective of communication is to appease, to save face, to avoid embarrassment, to avoid conflict, and to avoid confrontation. And therefore, saving face has a very big impact on how people communicate. So if someone says, yes, does it mean a yes? Or is it something about I may try and I think I will be able to complete the job? So appeasement comes very much into this whole concept of saving face. And if you get under the skin of saving face, it'll become easier for you to understand that people, for example, may not necessarily challenge their seniors, may not challenge their superiors. So even in modern India, though we talk about changing India, there are entrepreneurs, there are small companies, but the relationship between Westerners and India and the relationship between seniors and juniors in India has a lot to do with saving face. And bearing that at the back of your mind will help you understand how the saving face dynamic tends to work in business relationships. Let's look at the next sort of important point, group orientation. And what we mean by that, some cultures are very group orientated, some cultures are very individualistic. And a country like India is far, far from being very individualistic. It's very much about teams, it's very much about the community. I remember just last week, I was delivering a training program for a group of HR professionals. And one of the things they wanted to know was why do most people in India, when they write their CVs, include their father's name on the CV? And in India, it is just seen as a no-brainer because my father, or most parents, and India is a patriarchal society in general. So I owe a lot to my parents who have sort of brought me into the world, given me an education, probably taken money on loan to get me a good education. So I owe them a lot. So therefore, out of respect, I will sort of put my father's name on my CV. Or take another example. I remember one company in India, a large IT services company, they had shortlisted some, candidates for a particular job. They wanted some 100 Java programmers, and they interviewed a lot of people. They shortlisted these candidates, and about 100 odd people. They gave them appointment letters, but there was no guarantee that these 100 people would turn up for the actual job because they could have offers from other companies. So, what the HR department did was they invited the parents of these potential 100 employees to the workplace and had an open day for the parents. Now, where in the world would you invite parents of potential employees for an open day? Only in India. So, this is where we are talking about when you work with India, the degree to which the family matters and the group matters a lot. So, like for example, Japan, the group is very important. I remember coming across a very nice statement. It said in the US, children are taught that the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And in Japan, they are taught that the goose that honks gets shot. So again, this is obviously we're talking of generalizations. It does not mean everyone, but India is largely very much a group-oriented society. So when you work with India, bearing this in mind will help you sort of firm relationships in India. We have another two more important issues. One is about religion. Religion plays a very, very big role. It's not a private affair like, in many parts of the world, like the UK, for example. Religion is a very private thing. And I remember even when Tony Blair was in power and Alistair Campbell, who was his private secretary, they asked him about Tony Blair's religion, and he literally said, Downing Street does not do religion. And in a country like India, it's very much overt. And religion is almost sort of in your face in the sense that wherever you go, you will find external manifestations of religion very much everywhere. If you sit in a taxi, you will find a little statue of, for example, Ganesha, the elephant god. You will find a little tree. Below that, there'll be a small impromptu, improvised temple. And very often, as a Western company, when you work with India, you have a joint venture, it is quite common to see employees requesting for the idol of a god or a goddess to be placed in the office or a work environment. Even when you go to in London, if you go to the northwest of London, if you go to Alperton, Wembley, Ealing Road, many of the Indian shops will have a large statue of a god or goddess just kept at the entrance of the store. So religion plays a big role, and like I said earlier, remembering the different festivals, the different holidays, and also because people may take leave at different times of the year, and that can have an impact on business continuity. So though religion may seem as something quite small, it can have major implications when you are working with teams, colleagues, joint ventures, and stuff like that in India. And lastly, let's look at an important aspect where we talked about earlier about saving face, high context communication. And very often, because of saving face, people may be a bit relatively indirect in India. And especially when you're working with seniors, people may be more differential in their speech, may not challenge, may be seen as not taking initiative. This is changing in modern India, but the degree of change may not be very noticeable. And more importantly, in India or within India, peer to peer relationships don't face this challenge. This normally will occur because India, we said, is a status driven, status orientated society. You may see more when it is about the difference in hierarchy between two individuals. So, bearing in mind that what you see and what actually happens can be two different things. Now, lastly, we have two other sort of topics because, like we said, it's just a 1 hour session. We've almost come to about 40 minutes of this session. We'll look at communication and look at some of the issues that you are likely to face when working with India. So far, what we did was we started off with a little about India, trying to understand India in a more holistic sense. Then we looked at some of the key values and drivers while working with India, how Indians look at themselves, especially in modern India, and to what degree does modern India sort of change or what is the overlap between modern India and old India, and how the two are sort of almost umbilically linked. And now we'll look at communication in terms of how communication is impacted, what does it mean. So many of you who have worked with India or been to India, we have something called Indian English, which is referred to as Indish, and Hindi English, which is referred to as English. So just be mindful, it is quite different. So I have a few samplers here. Any idea what the word prepone could mean? Does anybody want to type out the answer in chat, please? Has anybody come across the word prepone? Okay. Vanessa says postpone. She's almost close. It is the opposite of postpone. So postpone and prepone are opposites. So in India, if something has to be brought forward in time, people would say prepone. Can we prepone the meeting from Friday to Tuesday? Pass out. Anybody come across the word pass out? Faiza says to hand out. And in India, to pass out normally means to graduate. And in the UK, to pass out is normally to sort of, after you have drunk too much, then you pass out. So the last one, just a little example, lax. Anybody come up with the word lack? Absolutely right. Faiza says 100,000. That's correct. And I think Ben also is about to type. Yes, that's the correct answer, 100,000. And again, in India, we have this unit. So we have lakhs, which are used for anything, for currency, for people, for number of cars, for population. So it's widely used in India. So bearing that the usage of English words in India can be quite different. And this is just a small sample. You may come across lots and lots of words. And this is not to sort of say, you walk on eggshells, but being mindful that the English used in one country may not necessarily reflect universal English as we may know it. So obviously English is not a universal language in that sense in terms of its usage and communication style. And like I mentioned earlier, because of the 22 main languages we have in India, official languages, people will have different accents. We know, for example, the Italians, the Spanish may speak, even Southern American, some Southern European languages can be a bit fast. So the speed of speech in India would be impacted by the mother tongue. So Southern India, people tend to speak faster. And then we looked at the vocabulary. So this was just a few words, loads of words in India which can have different meanings. I remember coming across a word called cribbing, Cribbing. Now, cribbing in the UK normally means copying or scribbling, but in India it only means one thing, complaining, whinging, or moaning. So, yeah, bearing in mind that this can be a challenge. And body language. So, Indians generally are quite comfortable with body language in the sense that we use a lot of signals for communicating, not just verbal, but the body language too. And as a result, when you have conference calls, video conference calls, it is important to take that into account when you're working with your colleagues or business partners in India. And inevitably, looking at the content and the context. So because India is a high context culture, very often the content has to be looked at in light of the context. So this is what we call as low context communication or high context communication, and that sometimes can be a challenge. And as I mentioned earlier, this applies generally more when there's a difference in hierarchy. So looking at all these will help you sort of develop your strategies in terms of understanding what needs to be done when you communicate with people in India. Now, lastly, having looked at all these different aspects of working with India, we'll look at some of the possible strategies which are useful to implement when working with India. The first is, like I said, India is a modern country, but we have a strong, big base of traditional India. And one simple example of this would be those of you who travel to India. If, for example, you go to India, your driver, your chauffeur would obviously be from the traditional India. He would not have gone, he doesn't go to a Starbucks, he doesn't go on holidays, He belongs to traditional India, but we need people like him, and that is where the link between modern India and traditional India comes. So you have a large group of people in India who are servicing modern India, and the two are sort of intrinsically sort of linked. And realizing where this nexus is becomes quite useful. And also realizing that you need to set a little more realistic expectations and being more mindful that if a project to start with, if you were to do it in the UK or in another country, and you have, say, for example, you decide it's going to be 10-person days. In a country like India, you add another 20 or 30% for various issues like cultural issues, teething problems, and the differences in the way you may approach some of these sort of things that we discussed. India is very much a chaotic country, and people thrive in the chaos. And as a result, people expect others to be very flexible. And change is the only constant in India. So, though in the West we tend to look at structure, order, in India we believe yes, it's good to have structure and order, but these things are likely to change. And we know we live in a very uncertain global environment, and being flexible and responsive to a change is seen as very important. So, making changes in a project or doing things differently, at the 11th hour, making some change. In one culture, it may be seen as not sticking to plan. In another culture, it can be seen as being very flexible. And India largely tends to look at that as a flexible issue. And more importantly, we looked at taking the time to build trust and relationships. And in a country like India, trust may take longer time to build. And diversity. You see, India has so many languages, so many different cultures, so many different sub-regions, and I'm always surprised. I quite often use Google, as many of us do, and if you go to google.co.in, do you know how many languages it comes up in? Any guesses? How many languages does Google come up in India? Pfizer's, no, sorry. I thought Ben is coming up with an answer, 23. No, surprisingly, it is still limited to 9. So, though there are 22 official languages, but what I'm trying to talk about here is that Google itself is available in 9 different Indian languages. So, when businesses are working in India, you have the opportunity to diversify because you have such large audiences. And also, when you have milestones working in India, making sure that there are much more frequent audits as compared to what you would have were you to develop the same project in the West. And like I said, also looking at how culture impacts the business operation at all levels, not just, for example, at the business dealings, because culture is something, it's like your DNA. You can't leave it at home when you come to work. So, in a country like India, how does it affect the whole range of operations, right from working with a chauffeur in India to a CEO in India? And when you're setting up operations, this becomes very useful. And I remember, reading a little case study on JCB, JC Bamford, which is a very large construction equipment manufacturing company. And all you go from another part of the world, when you go from your part of the world to India, obviously you mentor your colleagues, but at the same time take away things which can be incorporated into your own strategies. So, it's good to mentor your colleagues, especially when they're junior, as to how we need to find common ground, but at the same time, be willing to be mentored because, in India, we have a nice saying: for every problem, there's a right way, the wrong way, and the Indian way. So you will come across many of you who have worked with India. There's an Indian way of doing things, and sometimes that can yield better results. So keeping an open mind. And lastly, why do you have to have an open mind? I again came across a saying recently which said, the mind is like a parachute. It works best when kept open. And when you work with different cultures, especially in a more a complex or much more different culture like India, it becomes very useful to sort of have an open mind. And lastly, choosing to succeed. So, like they say, no one can make you unhappy without your consent. So it's up to us how far we can go to sort of, modify our strategies in order to be successful. So that was really, our sort of session for the day, where we ran through a whole host of things, right from understanding a bit of India, just an overall view, then looking at key values and attitudes of people in India and how you could apply them to business, looked a little about communication, and lastly, in a very broad sense, because this is just a taster session, we just had about 45 odd minutes, and realizing how in a changing India, you can sort of modify, adapt, and develop your strategies. So now, if anybody has any questions, we still have about a little under 10 minutes. You're more than welcome to unmute your phones or send any messages via chat. And the next 8 minutes, we can take them. I think somebody's trying to type some questions. So Judy is asking about tips on working with virtual teams across US and India. Obviously, that's a whole session by itself, but I think what becomes useful when you work with teams virtually, then many of these issues are going to be sort of, become much more magnified. And one of the first things to remember is when you're working virtually is to set up protocols. And by protocols, what I mean is, say, I send Judy an email and Judy does not respond to my email. What am I to make of it? Do I assume that Judy does not have the answer? Do I assume that Judy has not received the email? So, what is going on? So, now in a country like India, if someone does not reply to your email, the default is that they have not got an answer to your question. And that is what the assumption is. So, for example, if Judy were to write to me and I don't reply to her, I assume that she has understood that, I don't have the answer. Now, if we develop a protocol saying every email has to be replied to within 4 working hours, every voicemail has to be replied to within certain number of hours. So we both have the same understanding of the concept of time. Rather than saying, oh, in my culture, this is what time means. In my culture, this is what urgency means. So setting up a lot of protocols would become very important. I think Ben has a point. He says, I was interested in the Wembley example. We would think that being exclusive is important, and Wembley Stadium is not at all exclusive. Doesn't the status of selectivity matter? Or what we're talking about, Ben, here is in terms of the size. So, here for a person of that stature, like the Prime Minister, you require a big audience. You require a certain amount of showmanship. You require a certain amount of, if you want to use the word, bling. And that is what we're talking about. So it is a stadium is just a stadium, but it allows so many people to come and pay their respects to the Prime Minister. So this is more about sign of respect rather than just being exclusive. Marcia says India and Brazil, the main differences in business, they seem very similar. That is true because when you look at your the cultural dimensions, when we go into intercultural studies and when we look at cultural dimensions, it becomes useful to understand that many countries have similar dimensions in terms of privacy, hierarchy, religion, the family, food, and Brazil and India to some extent share some of those. Vanessa is asking, as a Western woman, it is sometimes hard when we meet business partners. We should just see how the male colleagues greet us. Is that right? Vanessa, you're spot on. Because India, though it is a modern country, we still have gender issues. It's a very ambivalent country. So you're absolutely right. Shaking hands, for example, between a man and a woman at a business level is not always seen as mandatory for doing business. If your male counterpart just says hello and then you respond by hello, that is perfectly right. If your male counterpart puts his or her hand out and you shake it, that's perfectly normal. And likewise, if you decide, say you're a CEO of a company, Vanessa, and you go to India and you have some colleagues working with you, male colleagues, and if you put your hand out, they will shake hands with you. They will obviously not refuse, but you may find that the handshake may be a bit limp, may not be as warm as responsive, but that is nothing to do with their sort of happiness at meeting you, etc. This is because how gender issues evolve in India. But you're absolutely right, Vanessa. You would take the tip from your male colleagues to. Marcia is talking about saving face. I don't know what she's implying. Oh, how to relate that, to relate to that. Yes. So when you talk about saving face, I'll give one little example. Say you find it difficult to understand the accent of your Indian colleague, or your Indian colleague is speaking very fast. Now, instead of saying you are speaking too fast, can you slow down? What you would say is you are speaking too fast for me. So that is how what you're doing is you're taking the onus of the blame in a way. So if you said you are speaking too fast, you are basically criticizing the other person. Or in a case where you're giving feedback. So for example, if Marcia tells me, Sunit, you have too many slides in your presentation, and she tells this to me in front of the whole class. Now, I may not retort. I'll say, oh, I'm sorry. Now, Vanessa may not, or Marcia may not realize that the number of slides were not my choice. The number of slides were determined by the company I work with. So if I'm criticized for something which I'm not responsible for, I would have lost face. So it is very useful to understand, yes, giving feedback is useful. Giving feedback happens in India, but unless you do not know what is going on, be a little careful about giving feedback because that will break the relationship between you and your Indian colleagues. So it's everyone gives feedback in India too, but how it is given is normally about saving face. So that is something to sort of bear in mind, that getting to the bottom of the issue before you actually give feedback.
Thank you so much. That was a fascinating overview of some of the changes and some of the traditions occurring in India and how we can kind of mesh those together. And I wish we had a little bit more time to explore in more detail, but the clock is ticking, unfortunately. If people do have other questions, feel free to send them to me and I can forward them on to Sunit. We will send the recording round, so watch your inboxes for that. And just a last mention, we have our next webinar. Next time we're focusing on the Middle East, and that's taking place on the 5th of July, so just a few weeks away. We'll send round the sign-up details soon, so again, look out for those. And otherwise, I think it's probably time to close now. So thank you all so much for joining and for your participation, and thank you once again, Sunit, for a fascinating hour.